I thank you for your words. Yeah, it's really a work in progress we are doing together, so I really want to stress this aspect. So I've been preparing the presentation really thinking how I would like to construct a solid research proposal for a postdoc on this topic. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you think about that. Yeah, I will start right away. So the basic idea of the project started when I realized that shadows are studied mostly, if not exclusively, as either information or noise about the things that surround us. So the idea is that basically it's a right idea, the fact that we, in our experience of things, we always learn, we have to learn to deal with shadows as either noise or relevant information to know the things that we are using to predict the position or the trajectory of things and the size of things and so on. So I think it's fair to say that shadows are mostly, if not exclusively, studied for what they are for our perception, and less, if not at all, as things we can play or imagine with. So that was the basic idea where I started. And this trend is the fact of studying shadows mostly as features of our perceptual engagement with things. Is shared by phenomenology, philosophy of perception, psychology, and for example, in psychology, the question is always, so to say, about when and how, for example, children learn to use shadows to perceive things, right? Unless, or there is nothing at all about when and how they learn to play with shadows. So when they can recognize shadows as things you can play with in a very basic sense. And I think the interesting question there is exactly to relate the two capacities. So see how the capacity of playing with shadows relates to the capacity of interpreting shadows as either noise or information about the things that surround us. And far from rejecting this idea, I intend actually to use studies on shadow perception in order to investigate precisely the capacity of playing with shadows, because I think that in that way we can understand important aspects of the relations between perception, imagination, and emotion. And in so doing, I would like to try to bridge the gap between, let's say, what shadows are for our visual experience and more symbolic or metaphoric meanings of shadows as we encounter in literature, for example, in popular culture, and so on. And one of the main challenges here is to understand the way in which the principles of, or the rules by which we process shadows in our perceptual engagement with things, how these principles are transformed, not only involved in our capacity of playing with shadows, or in how shadows are represented in images, for example, in art, which is something I will consider in the central part of the presentation. So basically the structure is, I will first have a very brief introduction, then I would like briefly to give you a general idea about how I would like to position shadows, the problem of playing with shadows within what I would call a kind of phenomenological map or a phenomenological geography of imagination. And then in the central part of the presentation, I would like to consider how some scholars in philosophy of perception consider shadows in what they are within perception. And then I would like to ask a few questions to indicate why it's worth investigating shadows, so to say, beyond perception. How from shadows within perception we can do more than perceive things, so to say. And then in what should be the number 4, in this last part, I would like to talk about a brief about 3 different stories or narratives about shadows. So let me stress that when I speak of playing with shadows, I'm referring to a very, very broad range of phenomena or experiences, which might include what I would call temporary, ephemeral, or improvised experiences, which are based on invariants of our perception and bodily experience, where the problem is actually just, the fact that in our perceptual experience, we kind of deal with some sort of imaginary paths in perception. And this photo is from the office here, and every morning when I come in, I like to spend like maybe 1, 2, 3 seconds observing those patterns, and I'm doing something, that's not playing with shadows, but it has something to do with the fact that we can enjoy a more playful engagement with perception sometimes. And then we have more complex and culturally structured experiences, which bring shadows closer to theater, shadow theater, and here, of course, the experience of shadows is something that depends on what you might call a kind of vocabulary of shadows, an inventory of shadows, which vary according to culture and culture. And I think that what is interesting is precisely to see how the two poles relate, if you want. So how in the experience of playing with shadows in highly culturally structured contexts like shadow theater, there is something you can understand precisely looking into perceptual aspects of shadows. So the main working hypothesis I'm trying to elaborate, and which I would like to present in a very solid way in my proposal, is basically to try to trace back imagination to the folds of reality and use the problem of shadows precisely as an example of how what we call imagination is something that emerges all the way down to our perceptual engagement with things in conflicts, discordances, and shadows are interesting precisely because they introduce in our experience highly, I would say, unreal aspects, conflicts, ambiguities that in a way we have to learn to deal with, and learning how to deal with these conflicts, we also learn, I think, to play with shadows. And the main hypothesis would be trying to emphasize two aspects. One of continuity, which has to do with the fact that shadows are a source of information or noise about the reality of the things that we use and deal with. And in this sense, shadows are processed as it is prescribed by the ecology of our perception. And the other aspect would be the one of discontinuity, which means that shadows are encountered beyond noise and information as things that affords imaginary paths in our perception and provide us invitations not to act upon things, but invitations to play with things. And the interesting thing is precisely how a phenomenological approach to the conflicts or ambiguities of our perception of shadows can be helpful to understand important aspects of playing or imagining with shadows. Now I would like briefly to give you an idea about how perhaps you could try to position the problem of playing with shadows in a phenomenological approach to imagination. And I think that one of the reasons why this is worth doing, I think, is because the problem of shadows would invite us to blur some boundaries and rethink the regions of this geography of imagination. This is basically a very, very sketchy and general account of imagination in phenomenology, where you would have different points of orientations, different regions precisely. So you have an important distinction that phenomenologists make between pure fantasy and perceptual fantasy, because one thing is to imagine with no contamination with perceptual reality, like thinking about a story like that. Perceptual fantasy would be like when you are, let's say, imagining through something, imagining with something, like when you see an image, a painting, for example, or when you see through the performance in blood and flesh of an actor, you can see through his body, so to say, and you can see King Lear, right? And there are important points of the orientations and distinctions because you can think of imagination as differently structured according to the extent to which you are aware of the fictional nature of what you are seeing, or different degrees of neutrality and freedom from the perception, different degrees again of being absorbed or immersed in what you are seeing. And then there are important debates about the emotions that we feel when we are imagining or seeing something through images, whether they are real or not. Of course, you can have a different kind of fear according to whether you are really seeing something for real, according to whether you are seeing something through an image, or if you are imagining of something. So that would be a very, very simple map of imagination. And where I think it gets interesting or relevant for an approach to the problem of shadows would be stressing how a phenomenological map of imagination is also a map of the conflicts or discrepancies or contrast between perception and unreality. And in that sense, I think that the problem I'm going to talk about has to do with the fact that there is a way in which, shadows present us with discordant scenes and an ambiguous pattern in our perception, because shadows can be really strange things, ambiguous, you have effect of deformations. And I think that what is interesting is to see how perceiving shadows, dealing with the ambiguities of shadows, can be connected to the perceptual fantasies that you can have with shadows. Precisely because you would have a relation between two different kinds of contrasts between reality and reality. And I would like to make a very simple example of playing with shadows, which is when you play with shadows with a child, and you can distinguish, of course, different stages, if that is the right word, or different aspects, different possibilities, different emotional responses to shadows, depending on, for example, whether shadows are taken as real entities, and if they are taken as real entities, for example, in a very, very early stage of development, you would have a particular emotional response, which I would say is about the fact that you are taking as real entities very strange entities, bidimensional, with no colors, and so on, right? Very transient and ephemeral. But what we are able to do growing up, so to say, and through the acquisition of very important cognitive and bodily skills, is to process shadows and to process the unreality of shadows, not as things themselves, but as indication or information about what things are. So there is this very important moment in our growing up. And then there is the capacity of playing with shadows and engaging with shadows as things you can play with. And one of the questions that I would like to explore here, and where I think that studies on psychology of perception would be very important, is the relation between the two capacities. So, does playing with shadows require processing shadows as visual information? I would say yes, but how is the very capacity of processing shadows and their ambiguous nature has informative about things? How is this capacity something that we can get that playing with shadows, so to say? So that would be, and I think that here we would have a kind of a sense in which we are dealing with a phenomenon that shows us how imagining is something that it's a kind of region of experience where we have to learn how to enter in this region, and it's related to cognitive skills, to many important aspects. So it's not something static. And one thing about imagination is that precisely that we should try to think imagination as something that is more like the result of a complex history or trajectory, which we make in our perceptual experience. So we should not start from the position of an adult imagining, right? And that's why I'm also interested in this topic. So now I would like to the central part of the presentation, which has to do with how shadows are considered in perception for what they are in our perceptual experience. And then I would like to ask a few questions to see in what sense we can discuss and think about the relation between how shadows are in perception and how with the perception of shadows we can do something more than perceive. So one challenge is, we have 3 ones here, sorry. One challenge is understanding how shadows are processed as information or noise about things, about the position, the present, the shape, the movement, and the affordances of things. And here, as I say, there is an interesting aspect, which is the fact that shadows are really ambiguous, they are bidimensional, they are ephemeral, they are transient, they are quite unstable entities, and the key is precisely how we learn to recognize these features of our perceptual experience as information. So it's like we have to learn to see that the bidimensional shape, of a shadow is not itself a real thing, it's an information about something else. Another challenge would be interpreting the specific kinds and forms of ambiguities and conflicts and uncertainty that shadows introduce in our relation with reality, and then how we respond to these conflicts, with what emotions we respond, and how ambiguities invite us to change our relation with reality in the form, for example, of an ambivalent relation with reality in a state of uncertainty when we do not know if the thing is real or not. And then another aspect has to do with trying to identify what particular aspects of playing with shadows or of the presence of shadows in art cannot be fully explained as consequences of the way we process shadows as information or noise about our experience. So what aspects should be rather interpreted as transformations of those principles by which we process shadows in our normal perceptual experience. And this is of key importance, I think, to understand how we get to have something more like metaphoric or symbolic meanings of shadows. These are two very important books in philosophy of perception about shadows. I think they share what I would call a perceptual or epistemic paradigm about shadows. The idea is that shadows and the ambiguities of shadows are revealing of how our vision works. Shadows, as they say, are negative and immaterial phenomena, but they are very important because they give us information about what things are, or about the presence of things that we cannot actually perceive, and I will insist in particular on this aspect later. And then for them, subject, artists or children, the way they deal with shadows is more like it's like scientists would do, they say, in the sense that it's about knowing, having, a familiarity with what they call a folk physics of light and darkness. And I think that these aspects are very important. I think that this approach works to a certain extent to understand what shadows are for us, but that's just a part of the picture, as I will argue. It's more like the starting point to see what shadows can be beyond our perceptual experience. A few quotations here. So shadows are extremely useful ingredients of visual knowledge. Shadows provide subtle information about the spatial structure of the world in a very automatic way. So it's not like we think, it's something very automatic. And this is the core argument and the most interesting part, I would say, because it shows that they work with this idea of shadows as noise or information, and they have this way of using noise as a metaphor that works also in the visual field, which is also an interesting aspect, I think. And they say, Casati and Canova say that we live and evolved in a world full of shadows. Vision learned to discount them when they create noise, but at the same time to take advantage of the information. So our evolution is such that we had to learn to tell when a shadow is noisy or when it's useful. And what is more interesting, and I think that will be clear from the next quotation, is that it's not like there are some shadows that are noisy and other that are information, but perceiving in the temporal nature of perceiving is such that perceiving a shadow is always an interplay of information and noise. Sorensen says that when reaching for an object, subjects exploit its shadow to perfect their grasp. Yet, in many other circumstances, adults ignore shadows as noise. And this is the first aspect interesting, I think, because it's that growing up is about learning to ignore shadows as noise. And one could make the argument that in part being adult is also about learning to ignore shadows as things you can play with. And then he goes on saying, one explanation of this on-again, off-again sensitivity is that shadow information is like scaffolding that builders must eventually remove. After this information is used to construct the visual scene of objects, facts about the shadow become an unsightly nuisance. So I like very much the idea of scaffolding, because it suggests exactly that the way in our perception we deal with shadows is like exactly scaffolding. So you need that, but when you get what you wanted, when you get your construction up, you have to leave them aside, right? So a question that I would like to ask is if shadows are only and always scaffold for perception, because it's a fact that there are experiences and situations where our perceptual and bodily engagement with shadows is transforming into more like a creative process where we engage and process shadows, but we are not motivated by a perceptual knowledge, the need or the desire to obtain more information about something. This is just what happens when you play with shadows, right? And to explore this question, I think we should, first of all, look into the riddles, the strange aspects of shadows, and see how these aspects can be a scaffold for imagining, rather than for knowing more about the perceptual thing. And the other aspect, which I will be dealing with, is that we should try to focus on what becomes of the very grammar of how shadows work in our perception once shadows happen to be in an imaginary context, like an image, a painting. And regarding the first aspect, I think that you can trace for every aspect which makes shadows useful and relevant and important for our knowledge of the perceptual thing, you could try to find a counterpart in how shadows can be used to imagine with. For example, shadows are indeed used and are relevant information because they can tell us about the presence of something that is out of our perceptual field. Like I can see the shadow of a tree behind me. They can tell again important information about shape, size, and movement of objects. And they have this bidimensional character, which is very important when you have to tell them from real objects. You see that they are not real, which helps you to use them as information rather than as real things. And for all these aspects, you might find counterparts in how shadows are engaged as, for example, as signs or symbols of absence. And we have playing with shadows many times is just about using effects of deformation or the fact that you can create silhouettes by putting different overlapping different bodies, right? In general, they are useless, armless, and immaterial paths. So they are things that you perceive, but there are things that in their immateriality, they do not invite you to do something with them in a basic sense, right? It's like you are walking and you have this path of shadows. They are not invitations to do something, right? So this is a very general aspect, but here I would like to follow the lead of Casati and Sorensen, who refers to some interesting situations about shadows in paintings. So there is this important passage in the book at the very introduction of Casati and Canavacus. They say that they are talking about the fact that they say little about symbolic aspects of shadows and cultural aspects, or how shadows play a role in popular culture and literature. So they are kind of making a distinction between a philosophy of shadows, which is basically for them a philosophy of the perception of shadows, a philosophy about how shadows work in perception, and other cultural symbolic aspects. But then they say, surely these aspects can exist only because the visual brain passes on shadow representations to other systems. So you have, and that's the important claim. One way or another, one needs to consider shadows for vision. And so that's, I think, that a project on the perception and imagination of shadows has to confront with these aspects. So in what sense should we start, or in what sense should we consider? In what sense do we need to consider shadow for vision to understand better other aspects of shadows, more metaphorical, symbolic? And I would say that I agree, in part I disagree with the position of these authors, as long as I think that one needs to consider shadows for vision, but because this is just the point of departure. This is where you start to understand what becomes of shadows when shadows undergo important transformations, precisely in practices like playing or art. So that's what I would like to show here. In what sense I think that we should start, that we should consider shadows for vision, but just as a point of departure, in order to understand more symbolic or cultural aspects of shadows. And the fact that they see shadow for vision not just as a starting point, but as the whole problem of their approach, you can see that because they can make sense of when painters do not get right shadows, when they make mistakes, or, there is this example. A shadow cast on a surface should not appear to have any volume of its own. Several late Roman mosaics and some modern paintings make the mistake or the deliberate move of giving shadows some volume. And that's exactly indicative of their approach, right? Because they can tell, they can bypass the problem of whether it's a mistake or a deliberate move, which would be more like an expressive choice. So my idea in general is that you cannot account for the sense in which shadows are present or absent in paintings, if you just stick with what shadows are for perception without considering what kind of transformations of the perception of shadows you have in particular context. Transformations that are still related to what they are and how they work in our perception. And many scholars share this idea, and they actually say, I think in a very intuitive way, that shadows are used in art to reproduce subjects in a realistic way. But it's not that common, actually. So we should not take for granted this. But I mean, even in realistic paintings, it's not that always the case. So they are not so universal as it might seem, or as one might expect. And my idea is that even if you look in so-called realistic paintings or paintings where painters are trying to get you a very realistic image, still there is something about shadows that points beyond the perception of shadows. And Sorensen briefly refers to this problem. And he said that artists prefer to provide information about objects through perceptual clues that are easier to render. So it's about finding easier way to be realistic. The geometry of shadows is known in principle, but challenging to put into practice. Most paintings that include shadows are not optically realistic. Why bother if your audience is likely not to notice? So his argument is the geometry of cast shadows is very complex. Shadows, as he said, are scaffold for perception, and so we go unnoticed because we don't need them once we have used them, right? So why should we doing that? So why should we bother with this geometry of shadows that we risk getting wrong if normally we don't notice them in our normal perception because we make use of that as a scaffold? And I would say that I agree with Sorensen's idea of shadows as scaffold for perception, and I so agree that I think that we should try to go to draw a more radical consequence from that about why and how shadows are present or absent in paintings. And Gombrich, I think, that makes this important remark. He speaks of a vital distinction between modeling, chiaroscuro modeling, and cast shadows. With chiaroscuro modeling would be when you use contrast between dark and light to render the solidity, the presence of the thing. And cast shadows he says that they are exceptional, while modeling is a universal feature in Western art. So this, I think, is an interesting point. So why? And my argument is that it's not because the geometry is not only or primarily because the geometry of shadows is different. It's for a different reason. And I would like to read this passage from Gombrich. However splendid the modeling in some of the paintings, the represented object frequently cast no or merely rudimentary shadows on their surroundings. We so realize that some of the greatest observers of nature appear to have deliberately avoided the cast shadows. Whoever reads their palette and their mastery of tone and color, they show us a shadowless one. It looks indeed as if many of the masters had studiously avoided inserting such shadows, as if they regarded them as disturbing or distracting element. So painters are great observers of nature, which deliberately, and they study how to avoid cast shadows. And this is precisely because it's not about the geometry of shadows. And many of the painters that avoided, like Leonardo da Vinci, that avoided cast shadows, they clearly knew a lot of stuff about the geometry of cast shadows. And my suggestion is that the shadows cannot be there in the canvas as things, but also on scaffolds, right? As Sorensen would say, which makes the presence of shadows something that in our perceptual experience is transient. It's not something there that we see, no, but our perception is temporal. So shadows are always in between, you know, being informative, but also discharged as noise. And that's what is difficult about shadows in paintings. So the real challenge is not the knowledge of and the reproduction of the geometry of cast shadows, but rendering the transient nature of shadows in temporal unfolding of perception. So artists, I would say, as observers of our perception, do not struggle with calculating the projection of shadows, but figuring out how to translate into an image which is static. The temporal unfolding and the transient presence of shadows. Because if you just have a shadow there, you get a very static image. It's not that realistic, because the perception of your shadow should be always, you know, transient and, you know, unfolding in between noise and information, like a scaffold. It's like, you know, you shouldn't be noticing the scaffold of your perceptual experience. So that would be an example, I think, of an imaginary, I would say, implication of shadows in a very realistic context of painting, because it's about figuring out the way to translate into an image, finding the expressive means to render not the geometry of a cast shadow in its instant, but the temporal presence of a shadow. And this is another example that I would like to consider. They refer to this very interesting painting. So they say movie directors, painters, and photographers have used shadows to generate expectations of presence or to widen the context of a picture to something that cannot be contained in its frame. And this is very indicative of how you need to consider what shadows are for vision and in our perceptual experience to know what this is about. But it's also an example of how you can just consider what shadows are in vision, because it's true that what is working here in the picture, in the painting, is the fact that shadows generate expectations about the presence of something that you cannot see. But the sense in which this function, this role of this role of shadows in perception acquired in the moment in which it's translated in a picture changes, right? So the sense in which there is something you can see is different here than your normal perception, because in the normal perception, shadows accomplish this function in the way that you know that there is something that you cannot see actually, but that you know that you could see because you just have to turn your head, right? So you see a tree falling and you can turn your head and move, right? That's why they are useful in your perception and very important to survive, maybe. Because they widen the spectrum of what we know. They make us aware that we are not seeing everything that we could be seeing. And here we have a different situation because the limit of your perceptual field is the frame of the painting. It's about what the painter decided to let you see or not. And the sense in which you cannot see something is obviously different. It's more like maybe an interdiction, a decision of the painter. And my point is exactly that we should be, you know, we can wonder about the reason for this, if there is symbolic reasons why you can show the body of Jesus Christ dying and so on, right? But the very possibility of discussing about symbolic meanings, about this absence that you see through the shadow, this spectrum of possibilities of interpretation is opened by the fact that shadows, a very perceptual function of shadows, of making you aware of something that you cannot see, is translated in a different context. And you wonder yourself why you can see what's beyond, right? So I think that that's an example of how, I mean, I'm not sure that you can say, as they say, that you are really using shadows to generate expectations of present. Because it's more like this use of shadows is generating a demand of sense, which is about the fact that I'm wondering why I can't see what's beyond the picture, why in the reality of my experience, this is not an interdiction or something I can't see, it's something that I could see. So you have this way in which the use of shadows, I think, translate or change the sense of this very bodily and perceptual sense of shadows, right? And I think, again, that what is phenomenologically relevant is what lies, I would say, before interpretations, like, why you can see the real bodies, right, in flesh, depicted in flesh and blood. It's about the fact that you have the shadows create a kind of demand of sense, because you wonder why you can't see. And I think I will skip this example. So I just considered a few examples where you could see the normal principles of shadows work in our perception, like indication of something absent. But of course, we would have to consider then other situations, contexts in art, for example, where artists do not use the way, I would say, the way shadows work as useful in our perception, but more like the noisily features of shadows, the way shadows deform our experience. Yeah, that would be another thing I would like to explore. So I would like to enter in the last part, referring to 3 stories or myths about shadows that I think are interesting to consider and that might help us understanding a few aspects of the problem. So the first one is this interesting story, very famous. Derrida wrote a kind of, not a commentary, a few pages about that, very interesting. And the myth goes back to Pliny the Elder. He says that modeling portraits from clays was first invented by Ptades, a potter of Sicyon, Corinth. He did this owing to his daughter, who was in love with a young man, and she, when he was going abroad, drew an outline on the wall, the shadow of his face thrown by a lamp. And her father pressed the clay on this and made a relief. So it's a story of how portraits made of clay was possible, starting from a silhouette, from the silhouette draw, starting from the shadow. And what I think is interesting about the myth is not what it shows, but what it kind of conceals, in the sense that it narrows down all the implications and the potential, I would say, of playing with shadows in relation to image making, and narrows down these possibilities to an already established tradition where image making is about making portraits. And what I would be interested in is in studying how this narrative, which is again quite limiting but interesting, it would be interesting to see how it narrows down the problem of playing with shadows to portraits and to this, in what Derrida calls simultaneous memory, right? And, there are many different representations, very interesting variations, different source of light, you have inversion between male and female. There is one in particular that I wanted to recall, and I think this is interesting because you have the main topic of the picture, is the origin of painting, which is what the myth is about. But then I think it's interesting to see how you have kind of minor topics in the picture with children that are, making the silhouette of an animal. And then you have this young guy, this young boy playing with shadows, which would be something that in a way precedes or does not overlap with the main topic of the picture, of the painting, right? Because the main topic of the painting restricts playing with shadows to making a portrait. So you need already to be able to, you already have access to something like portraits in order to use in that way shadows. And at the end, I would like to suggest, with considering cave art, in a moment, I would like to suggest that there is another way in which you can think playing with shadows as enabling image making, so to say. That's why I find interesting that you have the presence of this young boy playing and making images on the wall. Then we have another very famous for philosophers especially, example of shadows. There is this study suggesting that actually Plato had in view something very specific. In this study, you find an analysis of, terminological analysis, which considers which argues that basically Plato had in view a specific form of theater and comedy when referring to shadows, and something close to Aristophanes' comedy. And I think it's very interesting. He does a kind of analysis also of the verbs employed by Plato, where the problem is that this form of comedy is just about amusing, amazing. It has a very, very strong emotional connotation that seems to be what Plato is fighting, so to say, right? I would like to briefly refer to what Casati in another book says about why Plato decided to use shadows, to make the example of shadows, because I think Casati says something very smart. He says that there were no reason, apparently, to use shadows for this experiment, for this mental experiment. The statues, the marionettes would have sufficed, to be perfectly logical. Even flesh and blood actors would have served to make us ponder the distinctions between image and reality. And there is this very intuitive and with some good reason, people think that the main problem of this myth is about image and reality. And Casati says, I mean, it could be enough, if you have just marionettes. You don't need shadow, right? So why did Plato choose shadows? One answer, he says, is that shadows are a disturbing example of lesser entities. They are a diminution of the object that project them. They are flat, immaterial, and without qualities, without color. They are absences, negative things. A shadow is a lack of light. Negative things, he says, are bizarre. And these uncertain beings confuse the mind, they trouble us. As if that were not enough, shadows have always been surrounded by suspicion and fear. They are strange entities. So again, Casati stresses the epistemic, the perceptual instability of shadows. And he thinks that the reason why Plato chose this example is that shadows are not just images of things, but unstable images of things. But what I would like to suggest, also considering the other study I mentioned about the myth, is that perhaps what is really relevant is how the epistemic instability is exploited to create a particular form of representation and theater, which can create very strong emotional responses because of shadows and because of the kind of light that is used, which is firelight, which is by definition unstable. And the other aspect about Casati's interpretation is that he doesn't find convincing at the end Plato's experiment, because he says that there is hope for the prisoners and that you don't need a philosopher to bring you out, right? Because he says the prisoners have some reason for optimism. They can study the shadows carefully. That's very important. He said that they can study the shadows. They can reconstruct the three-dimensional forms of objects casting the shadows. There is a typo. They can grasp the mathematical beauty, which is a reference to what would be outside the case, the mathematical beauty of real things and proportion between. They can grasp the mathematical beauty of the relationship between an object and its shadow. Approach it in a certain way, the shadows turn out to be a magnificent tool for knowledge. This is why the final analysis of Plato's experiment is not convincing. Shadows can be used to reconstruct the world. The problem is that what Casati is not considering, or is not interested in considering, I think, is that prisoners cannot move in the story. So if they cannot move, they cannot see that there is something beyond shadows. So they have no way, even if they spend, I don't know how many lives there is no way they can learn to familiarize with the strange patterns of shadows and refer them to real things, the objects that cast shadows, because they cannot move, basically. So they cannot learn anything. And they cannot even see it. That's an aspect that Heidegger stresses. they cannot see the firelight. So that's the only light they have, the natural setting. And I think that that's really the reason why there is no hope for them, right? And they cannot really come to process, to recognize shadows as information, and as information that can be manipulated by playing with light, fire, and so on, because that's all what they have. And they cannot see that there is other person controlling the light, the source of light. And I would like just to consider, to conclude, an example of, suggest that in a way we can find another, we can construct another narrative about shadows in a way, in an opposite direction in comparison with the myth of Mutade, which is in the cave, and see how shadows were a very important element, a triggering element of image making in the cave. And this is a very interesting example, one of the examples you can find that has been studied by many scholars. You see how light and shadow are playing over a natural rock formation, and this play of light and shadow in combination with the particular irregularity of the surface triggered the imagination of this image maker to see something that was not there. And the author of this thing just had, to draw the red thing that you see is the whole image. So the only thing that was really made in the making of this image was this line. And they say that it's not something you can see always, right? It depends on where the light is, because there was complete darkness there, so they had. And so that's very important, the fact that the image that you make with shadows in this context are very transient and relative to your position. And that suggests what was remarked also by a German movie maker, Werner Herzog, who say that cave art is not the first example of image making, but it's the first example of movie, right? Because the use of light was such that, and the sparkling of the firelight, and the fact that you were using, you were controlling the light, it was really, everything was in movement, so to say. It was more like a performance. And this is a very important aspect, I think, and because it points to other aspects that I would like to explore about the use of shadows, which would be the importance of the discover, how you want to call it, of firelight, right? And on the one hand, we have really to make a great effort of imagination to think what would be living in a world where during night where the shadows that you have that surround us are triggered by an unstable source of light, which we are not that used now, right? And the other thing, it might be interesting, I think we were talking about that, about how, thanks to firelight, the control of fire gave to humans more daytime, more light time, but at the same time exposed our minds, to say, to a surplus of time which we couldn't use in a productive way, because it was night and you had predators outside and it was cold and everything. And so it's probably, and for sure, we were spending that surplus of time you couldn't know how to spend in a very enclosed spaces with irregular surfaces and, with social interactions and so on. So that would be another interesting element about maybe the role of playing with shadows in the, let's say, the evolution of our imagination. And and there are many other aspects more, general about the role of the cave, which would be very interesting to explore because they are indicative of something I've been not addressing here, that is the context in which you feel like playing with shadows, or the context where you can afford playing with shadows, or where you just play with shadows. Because the cave has many scholars have studied, that was a really unique place in the sense that it was a kind of world within the world, but it was separated by the world where you do stuff, you make tools, and so on. It was very dark, and it was a place of great disorientation, and where all your multisensorial experience was somehow dismantled, because it's a place where you can hear more than you can see, So it was very dangerous and frightening place, but also a place that inspired people to make images. And that's why I would like to locate here a kind of guideline for understanding the problem of the context in which we play with shadows. No, that's all.